Okay, so we just talked about different ways of studying things. If you were going to study play behaviors in children, what would you select? Would you do an experiment? Would you do a naturalistic observation? Would you use a case study? Or would you ask parents in a survey? Pause the video, answer it for yourself, and sort of think about why, and then unpause the video. An experiment could work, right? You could bring kids into a lab, into a playroom, not artificial, but a playroom that you had designed, and you could give them certain tasks, or you could tell some kids to do certain things and then see what other kids would do. So you could definitely do an experiment. You could also do a naturalistic observation. You could watch kids on a playground. You could watch kids in a classroom. You could go anywhere where kids are and just observe how they are playing with each other. You could do a case study and you could follow one child intensively and see how that child plays with other kids and try and think about what caused those behaviors or influenced those behaviors. And you could also ask parents what they have observed in their own children. All of those things have benefits. All of those things have flaws. If you're asking parents, you're not really studying a play behavior, you're studying parents' impressions of play behaviors. And so you have to be clear about what that is. And that's why it's important to know how somebody conducted a study so that when they tell you this is how kids play, it's like, wait, but is it really how kids play? Or is it how kids play in the lab? Or is it how one kid plays? Or is it how parents think kids play? So those are things to think about when you're selecting a research method or evaluating a research method. Scientific research is more reliable than just a casual observation. If you want to know who the best drivers are, if you want to know what contributes to that, you actually need to collect some data. Not all published research is free of error, right? And that's why it's important for there to be a number of studies that all point to the same finding before somebody says, oh yeah, this is how it is. I'm very skeptical when there's one study that takes the field in a completely different direction. It could be really interesting. It could be a landmark, groundbreaking study, but you need some other studies to also show that, because if it's just one, then that's a problem. So that's sort of thinking critically about it. There are all kinds of problems, and you'll learn more about it if you ever take a research methods class. Sampling bias, who you ask, and I've talked about this a little bit already, who you ask matters. If you are just studying children's play behaviors in your own neighborhood, then whatever you find might be true for kids who grew up in your neighborhood or grew up in your community or in your state or even in your country, but it might not be a universal truth. And so sampling bias, if you want a completely random sample, which is very different than random assignment, a random sample of college students, for example, might involve randomly sampling students from all over the United States. A random sample of community college students, you could get a list of all of the community colleges in the nation, and you could get a random sampling of students from each of those colleges. So there are a number of ways that you can address sampling bias, but sampling bias is different. A random sample is different than random assignment to groups. So that's just that. Placebo effects. A placebo is when somebody is given something like a sugar pill and they're told that it's a pain reliever, and then they measure whether or not they got pain relief. Placebos work, and we'll talk about why they work and how they work when we talk about how the brain works. But a placebo is something that is actually neutral, but seems to have an effect on your outcome. So a placebo effect can be, I could say that I'm teaching you something really important about creativity, and then I can measure creativity, and perhaps your creativity score, however I'm measuring it, would go up just because you thought you were more creative, and you weren't actually. So when you think about expectancy effects or those kinds of things, that's what the placebo effect is. Distortions in self-report, I've already talked about. There's a measure that I sometimes use in class and sometimes don't, called the Crown-Marlowe Social Desirability Scale. And usually when you give it to people, you give it to them and it's got sort of this is a puppies and kittens scale. We don't always want people to know what it is that we're measuring because we don't want their thoughts about that to influence the outcome. But social desirability bias is that sometimes people portray themselves in an unrealistically positive light, sometimes in an unrealistically negative light, and sometimes something in the middle. And so being able to measure that and to account for that when you look at their survey scores or you look at something else can be helpful. So here's an example of some of the questions that are asked. and you're rating these questions. So before voting, I thoroughly investigate the qualifications of all of the candidates. Is that true or false for you? Number 4, I have never intensely disliked anyone. Number 7, I'm always careful about my manner of dress. Now, you could be somebody who's very fastidious, very conscious of how you dress. But always is a big word. Are you always careful about how you dress? 24 hours of the day, 7 days a week, always. Before voting, I thoroughly investigate the qualifications of all of the candidates. All of the candidates, in the last presidential election, I don't know how many there were in the general election in North Carolina, but I think there were 4, and in other races that I've voted in, sometimes there are as many as 7. So did you investigate, or do you investigate the qualifications of all of the candidates, or maybe the top 2 or 3 that you're more familiar with? Again, some people might say, oh yeah, I always do that, or I don't vote. And that could be true for you. But if you consistently always paint yourself in the most positive light in answering all of the questions, and I think there are 33 on one of the measures that I use, then that says something about you. I never hesitate to go out of my way to help someone in trouble. It might be that you usually do that, but sometime you might have not been able to help and you thought somebody else would help. So those are the kinds of questions that are asked on a measure of social desirability. Experimenter bias. If you are measuring play behavior in children, you're the worst person to do the observations because you already know what your hypothesis is. So with experimenter bias, what we try and do is, if you're the experimenter, you try and get somebody else to go ask the questions, go do the observations, somebody who doesn't know what your hypothesis is. When I was doing graduate research on positive and negative emotions in children, I asked psychology majors who were at NC State who were getting research credit for it. They were getting independent study credit toward their graduation. I asked them to interview the children because they didn't know what my hypothesis was, but I did. And because I knew, it's possible that I would have made more eye contact when I was getting the kinds of answers that I wanted to, not intending to do it, but you can in very subtle ways. There's a story of Clever Hans, and if we have time in class sometime, I'll talk about Clever Hans, or you can Google Clever Hans, and that's one of the anecdotes, one of the studies that we often talk about when we talk about experimenter bias. Importance of replication is really important. And one of the first things I did as a graduate student was do a meta-analysis of the expressiveness of emotion in children based on the kinds of families that they came from. And so it was important not to look at one study or 2 studies, but we looked at almost 200 studies to see whether there was an overall answer or an overall picture that we could paint about how things played out using the combined power of 200 studies instead of just 1 or 2 or 3. Question of deception. Sometimes we deceive people, and sometimes that's gone really horribly wrong in psychology and in medicine and in many other areas of research. And so we have really strict rules about using deception. You need a really good reason to deceive people. It's one thing to not tell somebody what the true name of the social desirability scale is, and then afterwards tell them what it is. It's another thing entirely to be studying something and deceiving them about what it's about. And we will talk about some very unethical studies later in the semester. The Milgram study you may be familiar with, the Stanford Prison Experiment you may be familiar with, but there are many others. We've learned a lot along the ways. And so if you're going to use deception in your research, you have to be able to demonstrate to a board. There's a board at every university that approves or disapproves all research with human participants and animal participants as well. And so if you want to do a study, you write up your study. Here's who I'm going to ask. Here's how I get the sample. Here's what I'm going to ask them to do. And if you're going to use deception, you have to have that in there. And then a board of maybe 6 or 8 people will read it to see whether it meets the ethical guidelines for the American Psychological Association, the ethical guidelines for research with human subjects or with animal subjects. Animal research has also been fraught with problems, and so there's a code of ethics associated with that. At UNC Chapel Hill, there's there are people who are in charge of making sure that all of the animals that are involved in research there are being treated ethically. And so you have probably read about or will read about times when that goes wrong. And it tends to get into the news, but it's something that's taken very seriously in psychology. The ethical principles. So there you go. And then the last part of the chapter talks about finding and reading journal articles. Journal articles can be sort of a pain to read. Read the abstracts first, and the abstract sort of gives you, in a nutshell, what their hypothesis was, what they expected to find, what they found, and just gives you that in a nutshell. Reading the actual journal article can really give you a lot of information about, did they do a case study? Did they do, how did they get their sample? Was it a convenience sample? Was it really a truly random sample? So all of those things can be really interesting. All journal articles in scientific research tend to follow this exact same pattern. So it starts out with an abstract. There's an introduction that is what we call a lit review. It talks about all of the studies that came before and what they found, because you need to tell your reader what happened, and what we already know about this topic. So if it's play behavior in children, as an example, then what do we already know about that? And what are the big studies and the big findings? So if you're researching something for the first time, reading those intros or those lit reviews can really give you a good background in some aspect or some area of psychology that you're not knowledgeable about. The method you describe in great detail, or the researcher does, how they got their subjects, what they asked them to do, all of the instruments, if there was a questionnaire, some sample questions, and sometimes they'll actually attach the questionnaire. If they were doing observations, what was it they were looking for, and how did people measure that? And were they video recording it, or was somebody out there with a clipboard and a pencil and trying to take notes, which is really hard when children are playing because they change all the time. So what was their method? What did they find? So the statistical analysis, that can be the toughest part if you don't have a background in statistics yet. You may or you may not, but the discussion will talk about what those results mean. And in the discussion, that it's their job to tell you what they found and how they interpreted it and how they hope that you will interpret what their results were. Also in the discussion section, they will say, here's what we still don't know. So it's their job at the beginning to tell you what we already know, and at the end to say, okay, here are the things that might have influenced our results. So somebody, or maybe us, but maybe somebody else, needs to probably go and check these things. And based on what we found, the logical next step for more research in this line of research would be these things. So they're always making suggestions for research. So if you're ever a student and you're looking for a research study and somebody says you can study anything, and like, I don't know, go look at some published studies and then go to the discussion section, and they'll talk about that. And then the references, obviously, if they can look up the references, you want to be able to verify what they've said. Okay. And then last thing, plural of anecdote is not data. We've talked about this. We will continue to talk about this. Just because somebody has seen something in their own life, in their own experiences, and they've seen it repeatedly, does not add up to scientific evidence. It is not scientific stuff. It's not data. It's not what we would call data. So in a technical way, sure, it's data, but those data points are not scientifically gathered. So anecdotes can be really interesting. They can give examples. I use anecdotes all the time in class and in my personal life to give an example of something. I'm sure you do as well. But if we really want to know who those good drivers are or bad drivers are, we actually have to go collect the data. So that's it for chapter 2. And I hope it was helpful. And stay tuned for more conversations about this. Thanks. Bye.